You don't just remember conversations. You revisit them, quietly, repeatedly, as if something inside you refuses to let the moment settle. It happens when everything slows down. You're alone, maybe scrolling through your phone, maybe staring at nothing in particular, and suddenly, a sentence returns. Not the whole conversation, just a fragment. The way you paused before answering, the way their voice shifted at the end. You replay it, adjusting your tone in your head, testing different versions of yourself inside the same moment. Maybe it's a message you reread, noticing things you didn't see before. A shorter reply than usual, a delay that feels heavier now than it did earlier. Maybe it's an argument where you stayed calm on the surface but felt something tighten inside your chest. Or a casual exchange that shouldn't matter, yet your mind keeps circling back to one silence, one look, one detail that refuses to fade. You tell yourself to move on, but the scene returns anyway. And it's rarely the loud conversations that stay. Sometimes it's the smallest interactions. A joke that landed strangely, a goodbye that felt colder than usual, a moment where you sensed distance but couldn't explain why. You imagine speaking more clearly, or saying less, or pausing long enough to understand what you were feeling before you answered. Most people call this overthinking. They assume it's anxiety or insecurity. But what if the replay isn't the problem? What if your mind keeps returning because something about that moment touched your identity? Not just how you were heard, but how you were seen. Because you don't replay every conversation, only the ones that quietly changed something about the way you understand yourself, even if you can't fully explain what that change is yet. And the strange part is, you rarely notice when it begins. You could be doing something completely ordinary, walking somewhere familiar, listening to music, answering emails, and suddenly, you're back inside a conversation that already ended. Not the whole memory, just a moment that feels unfinished. A sentence you keep rephrasing, a reaction you wish you had slowed down, a silence that felt heavier than it should have. You replay it like you're editing a scene. In one version, you speak more clearly. In another, you stay quieter, more composed. In another, you finally say the thing you only understood hours later, when the pressure of the moment was gone. Maybe it's a relationship conversation where nothing dramatic happened, yet afterwards something felt slightly off. You reread messages, noticing tone behind the words. You remember how long it took them to reply, or the way they avoided a topic you thought mattered. And without realizing it, your mind begins building alternate timelines, small adjustments that might have changed how the moment felt. People assume this means they're stuck in their head. They try to distract themselves, pushing the memory away, telling themselves to stop analyzing everything. But the replay returns because it carries emotional weight. Not necessarily regret, just a quiet sense that something important wasn't fully understood while it was happening. Think about the conversations that fade easily. When you feel heard, when nothing feels misaligned, your mind lets them go without effort. But when there's even a subtle gap between what you felt and what was expressed, your thoughts return later, trying to understand what shifted beneath the surface. And that's why the replay feels so real. You're not just remembering words. You're returning to a moment where connection changed, even slightly, and trying to understand what that change meant to you. And if you notice which conversations stay with you the longest, they almost always involve someone who matters. It's rarely the stranger you spoke to once. It's the person whose opinion carries quiet weight. A partner, a close friend, someone you respect, someone whose reactions shape how you see yourself, more than you admit out loud. When a conversation with them feels slightly misaligned, your mind doesn't just move on, it circles back, searching for something that didn't fully settle. Maybe it was a moment where you tried to explain something important, but their response felt lighter than you expected. You nodded and let it pass, but later you replay the tone of your own voice, wondering if you made yourself clear enough. Or maybe they said something casually that stayed with you longer than it should have. Not because it was harsh, but because it felt unexpectedly true. Think about the conversations you revisit late at night, the ones where you imagine saying things differently, not to win the interaction, but to feel more aligned with who you are. You picture yourself being more honest, or less defensive, or simply more present instead of rushing through your own thoughts. And this is where relationships quietly amplify everything. When someone matters, their reactions feel like mirrors. A small misunderstanding with them can echo longer than a loud disagreement with a stranger, because connection exposes parts of you that aren't visible anywhere else. Sometimes you replay a moment because you felt misunderstood. Other times, because you realized you weren't fully honest with yourself while it was happening. That's why the memory stays personal. It isn't just a conversation. It's a quiet attempt to understand how you were seen and whether the version of you that showed up in that moment felt true or simply safe enough to get through it. Sometimes the replay starts with something so small, you almost feel embarrassed that it stayed with you. You open an old message thread for no real reason. You reread a sentence you sent days ago, and suddenly it feels different, like you can hear your own tone from the outside. You wonder if it sounded colder than you meant, or too eager, or more distant than you realized at the time. You scroll back further than you planned, trying to pinpoint the moment when the energy between you shifted. Other times it isn't a text at all. It's a memory that arrives without warning. A conversation where you agreed too quickly just to avoid tension, or a moment where you smiled while feeling quietly hurt. At the time, you told yourself it didn't matter, but later, your mind slows the scene down almost frame by frame. The pause before you answered, the way they looked away, the way you changed your words halfway through. You start imagining alternate versions. What if you had asked one more question? What if you had stayed silent instead of explaining yourself? What if you had trusted your instinct instead of adjusting your response? And sometimes, this part is harder to admit, the replay isn't about them at all. It's about recognizing a version of yourself you didn't fully like. The version that laughed to keep things smooth. The version that avoided conflict even when something felt important. The version that stayed composed because being honest felt too risky in that moment. Because not every replay comes from misunderstanding. Sometimes it begins when a moment shows you how easily you can drift away from your own truth without even noticing while it's happening. That's why certain scenes stay alive longer than others. Not because you're trying to fix the past, but because you're slowly seeing parts of yourself more clearly than you could while the conversation was still unfolding. What makes these replays feel so persistent isn't just memory, it's interpretation. Your mind isn't storing conversations like recordings. It keeps reshaping them, asking quiet questions you didn't have time to ask while the moment was still happening. Did I come across the way I intended? Did they hear what I actually meant? Was I being honest? Or just trying to keep everything smooth? And the more personal the interaction, the more your thoughts begin testing different emotional angles, not only to understand what happened, but to understand who you were inside it. Think about how often the replay begins after something subtle. Not a big argument, but a moment that felt slightly off. You leave a conversation feeling mostly fine, but later you remember one detail that refuses to settle. Maybe they changed the subject too quickly when you opened up. Maybe you explained yourself more than usual and felt exposed afterward. You start hearing your own voice from the outside, noticing the places where you softened your words or rushed past what you really meant. In close relationships, these moments carry more weight. You might replay a disagreement with someone you care about, not to prove you were right, but to understand why you felt unseen. You imagine saying less, or speaking slower, or allowing silence instead of filling every space with explanation. And slowly, something shifts. The replay stops feeling like a search for the perfect response and starts becoming a form of calibration, a way of sensing what a steadier version of you might sound like next time. Not louder, not colder, just more aligned with what you actually felt beneath the surface. Because sometimes the mind isn't trying to understand the past. It's quietly preparing you for a future moment where you won't need to replay the conversation at all. At some point, the replay stops being about the exact words that were spoken and starts revealing something deeper. How you move through connection when you feel emotionally exposed. You begin to notice patterns. In certain conversations, you explain yourself too much, as if clarity alone can prevent misunderstanding. In others, you become quieter than usual, choosing safety over honesty without fully realizing it at the time. And when you replay the moment later, you're not just changing the dialogue. You're imagining a different version of yourself inside it. Maybe you picture yourself saying, "Wait, that's not what I meant," calmly and clearly. Maybe you imagine holding eye contact instead of looking away. Maybe you imagine saying less, allowing silence to exist without rushing to soften it. These imagined versions aren't random. They reveal the qualities you felt you needed but couldn't access in the moment. Steadiness, clarity, emotional balance. That's why certain conversations replay longer than others. Not because they were failures, but because they showed you the edges of who you are, still learning to become. And this is where the replay quietly shifts from reflection to rehearsal. Your mind begins testing new ways of responding, not to change the past, but to prepare for future moments that will feel similar. It's not trying to erase what happened. It's calibrating how you show up next time. The conversation becomes a kind of internal practice space where you explore boundaries you didn't hold, honesty you didn't fully express, and silence you didn't allow yourself to keep. You're not stuck in the moment. You're learning from it, slowly, privately, until a steadier version of you begins to feel more natural than the one you were before. And eventually, something subtle changes in the way the replay feels. At first, you return to the conversation looking for the perfect correction, the exact sentence that would have made everything clearer. But over time, the urgency softens. You stop searching for flawless responses and start noticing patterns instead. The way you softened your opinion when the atmosphere shifted. The way you laughed when you actually felt tense. The way you stayed calm even though something inside you wanted to speak more honestly. You realize the replay was never only about them. It was showing you how you move through moments where you feel seen. Sometimes that realization is uncomfortable. You notice how often you protected harmony instead of protecting your truth. Or how quickly you adjusted your tone to match someone else's expectations. And for a moment, it might feel like regret. But it isn't. It's recognition. You're seeing your own habits clearly for the first time, without needing to defend them. That's when the replay begins to lose its sharp edges. Instead of arguing with the memory, you become curious about it. You notice how your imagined responses grow calmer, more grounded, not louder, not more confrontational, just more honest. The scene stops feeling like a mistake you're trying to fix and starts feeling like a mirror that showed you something important about yourself. And once that shift happens, the conversation doesn't feel as heavy anymore. It becomes less about rewriting what happened and more about understanding who you were while it was happening and who you're becoming because of it. And maybe that's the moment when the replay finally begins to quiet down. Not because the memory disappears, but because you stop fighting what it revealed. The conversation that once felt tense starts to feel softer, almost distant, not erased, just understood. You're no longer searching for the perfect response or the exact sentence that would have changed everything. Instead, you begin to see the moment for what it really was. A glimpse into how you relate to yourself when connection feels uncertain. The conversations that linger aren't always the ones that went wrong. Sometimes they stay because they showed you something honest. A boundary you didn't recognize until later. A feeling you couldn't name in real time. A version of yourself that was still learning how to stay present without adjusting who you are. And here's the part most people don't expect. Some conversations fade, not because they were resolved, but because you changed. The version of you who needed to replay the moment slowly gives way to someone who understands it without revisiting it again and again. That's when the loop loosens. It becomes integration. Your mind returns not to rewrite the past, but to understand who you were in that moment and why it mattered. Each revisit adds clarity, turning confusion into awareness, tension into perspective. Because conversations don't truly end when the words stop. They continue shaping how you show up next, how you listen, how you respond, how you allow yourself to be seen without constantly reshaping your voice to fit the moment. So maybe the goal isn't to silence the replay. Maybe it's to recognize that your mind is learning in slow motion, helping you understand yourself more honestly until the moment no longer needs to return, because you've already carried its meaning forward. If this made sense to you, you already know why you're here. We'll talk again.